Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Research Tuesdays event, Low Voter Turnout, High Stakes. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Kaurna people, the original custodians of the Adelaide Plains and the land on which the University of Adelaide's campuses at North Terrace, Waite and Roseworthy are built. My name is Olivia Bellis and I'm a PhD candidate in the School of Biomedicine here at the University of Adelaide. Tonight, we're discussing the importance of voter turnout. When fewer people vote, trust in leadership declines, marginalised communities are excluded, polarisation increases, and democracy backslides. Ahead of the federal election on May the 3rd, Professor Lisa Hill is here to remind us that your participation can change all of that. Lisa is a professor of politics with expertise in the intellectual history of the Western political tradition, democratic theory and electoral studies. She is a fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences of Australia, program director at the Stretton Institute of Public Policy, essay governor of the Electoral Regulation Research Network, and research chair of anti-corruption watchdog, the Centre for Public Integrity. Please join me in welcoming her to the stage.
Hi everybody and welcome, and thank you for your interest in your own democracy, because it's welcome and needed, isn't it? And we're all very aware of that as of yesterday. I just want to make a couple of comments about what I'm not going to talk about today. People might have come here thinking I'm going to predict the result of the election. I don't do that kind of work. I'm not going to comment on the campaign itself or the performance of our political representatives. I'm more interested in the big picture, what's going on with democracy, how to protect democracy. So I'm very interested in democratic resilience, democratic self-defence, it's called now, because democracies are having to defend themselves from threats, both internal and external. A lot of my work tends to be about seeing fins in the water coming towards Australian democracy and seeing if we can cut them off at the pass or start working to prevent them from really harming our democracy. So today I want to see what you get for high turnout. And in Australia, because we have compulsory voting, we already do have quite good turnout. But what do we get for compelling people to vote? It doesn't matter if turnout's declining, which it is. So at the last federal election in 2022, voter turnout dipped to its lowest level since voting was made compulsory. It was made compulsory in 2022, but our first federal election with compulsory voting was 2024. So it's concerning that turnout's dipping. For years and years and years, 95%, 96%, 97%, very high, the envy of the democratic world, still the envy. But you know, the question today is, if it's dipped to 89.7, do we care? Does this matter? Now, this is not a trend that's restricted to Australia. It's happening globally in established democracies. The patterns are different. Every democracy is different. But in established democracies, well-established ones with properly run elections, this is something that's happening. Often in a new election in a country that's developing, there'll be high turnout because people are very excited, but in established democracies, people are getting bored with democracy. Now, the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, which is the global peak body for democracy studies, reports a net decline globally in overall democratic performance. So that's not just turnout, that's in the way that governments are responding and behaving, the extent to which democracies are doing their job of being democracies, being of the people, for the people, by the people, that sort of thing. And we have the global participation rate falling as well, from 65.2% to 55.5% in 2023. I haven't got a figure for 2024 because they started capturing it in another way that wasn't helpful for today. But take my word for it, it's downhill all the way. To give you some perspective on our turnout levels, I've given you a list of the different kind of countries, most of them developed, with well-established democracies. And I've given you the first set of figures and the larger figures there, the turnout figures. Now next to that, I've given you the Freedom House scores. So the first set of scores from IDEA and the second set of scores is from Freedom House. And I haven't provided them for each setting, but this is to put it in context. So you might think, oh, well, we're not that good compared to Rwanda. Because they've got 98.2% turnout, right? But look at their Freedom House score, 21 out of 100. That means there's something wrong there. The election wouldn't have been run properly. There was probably fraud involved, which there is. Opposition parties were probably suppressed. So you'd be comparing apples and oranges. What you want to do is compare it with an established democracy with good freedom ratings. For example, with Belgium, which is another compulsory voting regime, or Denmark, which has an equivalent score, Netherlands, equivalent score. There's Canada, 97 out of 100, better than us. But look at their turnout, 62.25. Or the UK, not bad freedom scores, terrible turnout. So that's what you compare it to. If it's a properly functioning democracy that's doing the election more or less properly, with lots of political and economic and social rights, and it's still got low turnout or high turnout, that's the country that we want to compare ourselves to. So we're doing pretty well. So we're reasonably inclusive with fairly socially even turnout. By socially even turnout, I mean the turnout's not clumping. In voluntary systems, it will clump. Has anyone got any ideas where it will clump into? Where will the clumps be in turnout? People like you. Probably educated, prosperous people. It'll be more likely to be white people. It'll be people with houses, people that have lived in that country, long-term citizens, those sort of people. It'll clump in a way that we wouldn't think of as socially even. But in Australia, turnout is spread evenly across all the demographics. That's what you want in a democracy. Assuming you want an inclusive democracy. Not everyone does, and I'll come to some of those people in a minute. But we still have gaps, and we're working on those gaps. Australian electoral authorities and scholars of elections as well take these gaps extremely seriously and work hard to try and close them. We have gaps among First Nations people. We have gaps among people experiencing homelessness. We have really, really scary gaps among the young. That is really a worry for me, because the young are the future of democracy, obviously, and they already have enrolment at least 10 points behind the all-age population, and then on top of that, a further 10% lower than the rest of the population turn out to vote. So we're getting about a 15 to 20 point gap between the turnout of the young and the rest of the population. That is kind of scary. We don't want that. Many prisoners in Australia can't vote. Again, these numbers aren't big, but it signifies that it's not an inclusive place. It's not a friendly place. It's not always nice to people. And we want to try and get everyone in on the story so we can get everyone's point of view in our democracy. That's what a healthy democracy should do. And the other problem with turnout now is informal voting. Now, those people have actually turned up to the polling booth, right? But they haven't registered a formal vote. Now, the rate of informal voting has doubled since the late 70s. And so that is a form of, in a compulsory voting system, it's the only legal exit option. So a lot of it's intentional, a lot of it's unintentional. But we want to try and work out what's driving it and see if we can reduce the rate. Right now, that's what I'm working on. So at various times I've worked on all these problems, and as I go along, I continue to work on them. I'm running 2 ARC, Australian Research Council linkage grants, one with the Victorian Electoral Commission and one with the Victorian the Electoral Commission of Queensland. We've actually got very different patterns of informal voting in those 2 states, which is kind of weird. So we're just going to try and work out what's causing it and then try and address it. Of course, with any problem, it's just like medicine. If you want to solve a problem, you first have to work out what's causing it. Why people are behaving in this way? Why are people throwing their vote away? And why are people inadvertently throwing their vote away? A vote's a precious thing, I would think. But anyway, we normally have pretty high turnout. But is high turnout something to celebrate? Now, I personally think it's something to celebrate. I'm quite proud of our high turnout here. But some say, no, it's not something to celebrate, big deal. So here are some of the interlocutors I deal with. So there are paper wars going on all the time between myself and other scholars. Ben Saunders, for example, says that a country with universal suffrage and high levels of turnout isn't any more democratic than one that does have universal suffrage but not high turnout. As long as everyone has the right to vote, what's the problem? Annabelle Lever says the same thing, that these low turnout elections aren't less legitimate than the high turnout ones. And there are even people like Jason Brennan that say that the low turnout elections are more legitimate. And I'll explain why in a minute. So they say, look, democratic legitimacy only demands that everyone has the opportunity to vote. All systems want to be democratically legitimate. Either they do things to make it democratically legitimate, or they try to project the perception that it's democratically legitimate. But nobody wants to be seen as not democratically legitimate. And I think our system does quite a good job of both looking and being democratically legitimate, and actually Australians see it that way too. You'd be surprised, well, you might not be surprised, at how clearly Australians see things in the political environment. So they say, look, the democracy is still healthy, even when large numbers of electors fail to exercise their suffrage rights. And I just wish I could gather them all in a room, but they live in North America and Europe, and say to them, well, how low would be okay for you? Is it 40? Are you okay with that? Do you think it's legitimate if only 20% vote? Or 15 that you will get in some gubernatorial US elections? What about 0? Is 0 okay? And they would probably say, yes, that's okay. If people have the right to vote and they choose not to, that's fine. But to me, that's worrying. The other thing they say, and this I thought sort of did have me, this is just a number. Is it just a number? Am I just fetishising the turnout numbers? Or does the number actually mean something? It's not just a number. I don't think it is just a number. The people does not mean some of the people. It means everyone. And unless everyone votes, we can't know for sure what the people really want. We only know what some of them want. Invariably, they're better off. So a lot of American low turnout sort of fans, or people that aren't worried about turnout, will say, oh, we polled people afterwards and they said, oh, that's the party they would have voted for anyway, so we got the information we needed. But the poll's not the procedure, and also polls are inaccurate, and non-voters are notoriously misreporters, and so are people that voted for the other party. It's called a bandwagon effect. They'll say they voted for the winning party when they actually didn't. Some say we know what abstainers want, and their failure to vote actually denotes tacit consent. Yeah, I'm fine with it. You guys just do the voting and I'll just go along with it. Others say, like Ben Saunders, that only the people that are more greatly affected are voting, and so that's a good thing. And the people that aren't really affected by the outcome of the election aren't voting, and that's why they're not voting, because they know it doesn't affect them. Does anyone have any idea what's wrong with that argument? Yes, exactly. Is there any such thing as a non-affected person in an election? Everyone's affected. And the people most affected are the poor, because in terms of marginal utility, a lost dollar in terms of a tax break or the cost of living means more to a poor person than a rich person. And yet they're the very people that don't vote in these voluntary systems. So, of course, they're affected. A lot of the times it's just sophisms for ideological reasons. So these are just surmises and actually inaccurate ones. I've written undoubtedly, but I mean certainly. And so instead of guessing at what citizens, I'm just being polite, instead of guessing at what citizens want, let's find out for sure, just to be on the safe side. So my main questions today are, does turnout matter? Does the quality as opposed to the quantity of voter information change when we have high turnout? Does high turnout do us any good? What good is it actually doing us? And in Australia particularly, what do we get for our high turnout compulsory voting money? In a setting where you are having to vote when you might not feel like it, and where the vote is basically coercion, we can't kid ourselves it's not coercion, because if you don't vote, there's a penalty, isn't there? Now, it's a mild penalty, but it's still a penalty. So if you're going to coerce citizens to do something, you better have a good reason. That's kind of the rule in liberal democracies. Don't coerce people to do things unless there's a good reason. Don't go through red lights. We have a good reason. Wear your seatbelt. That's a good reason. Send your children to school. That's a good reason. There are good reasons for this. But do we have a good reason for compulsory voting and for getting that high turnout that it brings us? So does obtaining more information from voters yield any qualitatively new or different information? Is it just the more of the same kinds of information? Therefore, it's harder to justify compelling people if you're just getting the same information coming in. Yes, we do get new and different information when we have high turnout. When turnout's high, more diverse inputs are captured, and because turnout is more socially even. The people that wouldn't vote in a voluntary system, the poor, the young, culturally and linguistically diverse people, the unhoused, the unemployed, those with disabilities, the ill, the incarcerated, the less educated, and those who live remotely are all going to be voting in this system. And they're going to be voting because the state here, knowing that it has compelled people to vote, has tried to make it as easy as possible. So if you're in hospital, they'll come and bring the vote to you. If you're incarcerated, they'll bring ballots to you. If you're in a remote area, they'll find a way. If you're on an Antarctic supply ship, they will post you the ballots, and they will send them to the bases as well. They'll ship tons to the Northern Hemisphere and all around the world so that the diaspora can vote. Our electoral commissions go to a hell of a lot of trouble to make sure what you're being compelled to do is not too hard for you to do. It's like with schooling. If you're going to compel people to send their kids to school, you better make sure you've provided some schools and at not too far a distance from people. Otherwise, it's not fair to impose that burden on them. Some people might say, so what? Big so what? Voting counts. Voting actually protects our material interests. Sometimes it feels like it doesn't. Sometimes it feels like it's just a drop in the ocean, but it actually does. And do we really want only the interests of voters to be protected? So if we had a voluntary system, look, in voluntary systems, governments are supposed to protect the interests of everyone, not just people who voted, and not just people who voted for the winning party, right? But politicians don't do that. They pork barrel. They serve their constituencies. You need a mechanism to make them do what they're supposed to do, look after everybody. And high turnout does that. Governments, we know, are more attentive to the demands of habitual voting groups at the expense of those that abstain. And there's a picture I put up of Vernon Dahmer, who was an African-American civil rights activist, who famously said, if you don't vote, you don't count. And Marty Wattenberg, who's an American political scientist, said politicians are not dummies. They know who their customers are. They know who their customers are, and they love their customers and they look after their customers. High turnout causes representatives to think and behave differently in their formulating their policies, allocating resources in terms of their attention. Who do they attend to? They attend to voters. So sometimes we have natural experiments that prove this, and a natural experiment was in the US after women got the vote. Suddenly there were large increases in public health spending to reduce child mortality. I don't know why the male voters didn't care as much about it. They were their children too, but the women seemed to care about that more, and they knew that it was good for votes. So more money started to be spent there. You saw when, in the 60s, when more African Americans came into the electorate, suddenly in black neighbourhoods they had garbage collection and lighting. So sociologists tracked the changes. The money and attention and the spending followed the voting. There is no shortage of studies detecting this strong relationship between electoral participation rates and public policies that impact social spending, health services, education, public amenities, that sort of thing. And that's particularly true of redistribution that occurs for those on lower incomes. The bottom line is governments in high turnout and compulsory voting settings are responsive to more and different kinds of citizens, and attention is more even, as it should be. Democracy is supposed to be about everyone. Democracy is about equality, and it's about inclusiveness, and it's about the people as a whole. But can I just say, before I move away from the different kinds of information, even if the information we got from people that normally don't vote in voluntary system, usually the poor and the marginal, even if the information about their preferences were exactly the same, it still would be different information in the sense that it would be now complete. All right, you think the same as all the well-off people, but now I know. At least I know for sure now I can go forward when I formulate the policies. Now, I've been saying for a long time that the people means everybody. Now the Australian, and that's why compulsory voting is justified. It means everybody when we say the people, the demos. Sections 7 and 24 of the Australian Constitution state that the Australian Parliament will be directly chosen by the people. Now remember, there's no explicit right to vote in the Constitution. This is an implied right. Our High Court has been quite creative in saying there's an implied right to vote. And they've decided that the phrase the people means what I mean by it, all the people. So our High Court is particularly attentive to any attempts to encroach on voting rights. They don't like it. They get very upset. It's very hard to do voter suppression in this country now. And this is just to do with the composition of the High Court. A High Court in the future might have a different composition, but right now we've got one that really cares about this. And Anne Toomey, who's a constitutional lawyer that you're probably all familiar with, she's saying it's arguable now that the law, anyone trying to make voting voluntary in this country would run into trouble with the courts. She's saying the courts will probably say that's constitutionally invalid because the people means all the people. And I think she might be right. So high and socially even turnout's better from a complete information point of view, but also from a responsiveness and representativeness point of view, and that enhances legitimacy. We want to be legitimate, and we feel more legitimate as a nation when we have high turnout, because we've got everybody's preferences fed into the system. When you have a voluntary system, the more prosperous members of society vote. And I should tell you at this point, politics, the political and electoral environment now is super, super volatile. Things are changing a bit. So now we're getting, say in the last American election, poorer and less educated Republicans voting, which you didn't get before. That whole thing's in flux. Hasn't quite caught up here. But we've got other changes in the ecosystem. But it's all volatile. But what I'm telling you today is what I know so far and what is probably going to continue into the future. But I have no crystal ball, and anyone who made a prediction right now about politics would be out of their mind, because I think we all know we don't know what's going to happen. Having said that, in Australia it's very stable, and we have protective measures that stop that volatility in our democracy, and this is what I'm talking about here. This provides protection. So in these voluntary systems, voting just helps those who are better off. Here, everyone's preferences count, and so they do in any high turnout setting. This enhances political equality. Political equality is the unicorn of democracy. Democracy is supposed to be about political equality. That's what it was invented for. Everyone could be an equal and ultimate unit of concern. And if you can find a way to make everyone equal, that's great. And one way to do that is to make sure everyone votes, and also to make sure the voting system's fair and that the boundaries aren't skewed. So, for example, if you've got turnout in a particular electorate of 50% and 50% don't vote, the voting power of the 50% who vote is doubled. It's just simple mathematics. That's not one vote, one value, but when everyone votes, everyone gets power. And in a system that's run properly, it is actually one of the few occasions in the whole wide world where every single person is of ultimate and equal value and has equal standing and enjoys equal respect, especially in this country where our electoral commissions really want everyone's vote. Of course, being able to honour political equality enhances democratic legitimacy. So in electoral constituencies where the participation of the disadvantaged is greater, welfare policies are more generous, and the state tends to be more redistributionist. These states tend to have more social spending and therefore less wealth inequality. So compulsory voting is strongly correlated with lower levels of wealth inequality. So the political equality translates directly into more wealth equality. And we don't have a wealth equality that's the best in the world or anything like that. It's just okay. It's about halfway up the ranking of the OECD, but it's not bad, because we're by no means as wealthy as some of the higher ranking countries. It's harder for us to redistribute. So what else might you get for your compulsory voting dollar and your high turnout dollar? High turnout's correlated with high levels of satisfaction with democracy, not just here, but everywhere else that there's high turnout. Recently, there's been a decline in these levels. These are due to failures of governments to honour promises. to prioritise the right issues. People perceive that politicians lack independence from either big business or unions. In 2019, trust in Australian democracy got to its lowest level ever at 59%. It spiked to 70% in 2022. That's more to do with whenever you have regime change, that's when the government change, that's positive, that's perceived as positive, you'll get a spike in a lot of things, satisfaction and happiness, that sort of thing. But it remains to be seen what the levels are like after the next election, whether they're still high at 70% or if they've gone back down again. What else might you get for your high turnout dollar? Increased levels of trust. Participating in properly run elections, not dodgy ones, that's not going to increase trust. It's got to be a properly run election. And we know the least trusting citizens don't vote. And that one of the best ways to get them back into the trust cycle is to get them to vote, to connect them to their democratic institutions so that they feel politically efficacious. Now, political efficacy is when a person has a subjective sense that they have some control over what happens in the government. And not voting makes you feel less powerless. Then you get yourself into a vicious cycle. If you don't vote, you become more powerless. Governments ignore you. Young people wonder why governments ignore them. You don't vote. You've got to vote, join the dots. Start voting and they'll start noticing you. Hopefully that will change at the next election. So the institutions then become more responsive if you're voting. This in turn increases trust in them. So you want to get into this participation, responsiveness, trust, virtuous circle. So compulsory voting, or any other way you might have of raising turnout, it doesn't have to be compulsory voting necessarily, it just turns out it's the best way of raising turnout, is an extremely powerful form of democratic self-defence. And why am I using that phrase, democratic self-defence? Because democracies now are in trouble. They're under attack. They're under attack by dark forces. And democracies now have to defend themselves. And we need to, there are political theorists, and I'm one of them, working on democratic self-defence. Sometimes it's called militant democracy, but it's when democracy says, no, we're not going to tolerate this, we're not going to put up with it. For example, what just happened with Marine Le Pen in France, which scandalised some people, but some people felt it was a good thing. What else might you get from high turnout? Well, it both constitutes and enhances social inclusion. It is a form of social inclusion. When you vote, you're doing something that everyone else is doing. And especially when we used to have just one day voting, which I prefer, in person, we were all together there with the democracy sausage, all seeing each other, doing our democracy together. And also it enhances social cohesion. And when I was reading the work of a colleague who was working on compulsory voting, I also noticed some other work she was doing. Her name is Victoria Shinneman. And she and other, mainly US scholars, were working on how ex-felons felt when their voting rights were restored. And it gave me a lot of ideas about how important voting is. Now, what happens in the US setting is, until very recently, if you were convicted of a felony offence, you lost your voting rights permanently, long after you had served your sentence. So there were some states in which African American male voters never could vote again and were just completely disenfranchised and out of the system. Believe me, it's not just an unintended effect of a conviction. It was deliberate. They wanted to shrink. It was a form of voter suppression. But these studies were showing that the laws over time have been repealed. There's only a few states now that still have that permanent disenfranchisement law. And, but the felons didn't know about it. So when they were informed that their rights were restored, it made them think very differently about themselves. They stopped seeing themselves as stigmatised outsiders and started thinking of themselves as stakeholders and insiders. So it got me thinking about the symbolic, psychic and social benefits of voting. And I think they're probably more important. And I noticed the same thing when I was working with unhoused people, the way they felt about voting. And it made me think this could be something really important for unhoused people to do because they don't really vote. So here's Victoria Shinneman. She's a colleague of mine and a friend. She's also a slam poet and a comedian of a professional standard, so I don't know how long we've got her in political science. But she did these fantastic studies. She's got guts like you wouldn't believe. And here was her study that she did as a PhD. She put up signs in bodegas all around in these American cities saying to ex-felon, if you're an ex-felon and you'd like to be part of my study, give me a call and we'll set up an interview. And she got quite a few responses. Then she'd set up an interview. She'd do a survey with them about their attitudes to law and order, attitudes to other people, attitudes to themselves, how they felt about themselves. Then she informed them that their voting rights had been restored, and most of them had no idea. And she said some of them, when she told them that they could actually stand for public office, were very excited, very happy about that, and said they planned to do it. Later on, she got them to come back and interviewed them again and surveyed them again. And she found that it enhanced pro-social attitudes and behaviour. This means a greater willingness to cooperate with authorities, less willing to hurt or infringe on the rights of their fellow citizens. And this is the thing that blew my mind: reduced rates of recidivism. That's the benefit that making people feel part of something brings, that you have stigmatised, pushed outside, and made to feel like they're nothing. But if you get them voting again and tell them that they can, even the thought of voting had this effect. So voting, we know, it connects people to their communities and it confers social recognition. Everyone needs recognition. Everyone needs to feel that there's somebody. They have rights. They might be a bit important. And we noticed this same attitude with unhoused people. That when they voted, we interviewed them before and after voting, and they said they felt a little bit more like members of the community. But we've got a long way to go with unhoused people, believe me. Good luck, Tori, on the rest of your research, because every study she does is like that. Takes a lot of guts, a lot of effort, and comes up with these incredible findings. Now, what else might we get for our compulsory voting buck? Well, here's a weird one that blew my mind when I first saw it. Australians, not so much now, but up until about 2010, but a little bit less now, felt more strongly than anyone in the whole established democratic world that you should obey the laws. Yes, it's the law, you should obey it. And it's like, what? Australians? I found that very odd. But we do objectively rank very high on law and order in the international rankings. We're 11 out of 142. Not just for our attitudes to misbehaving, but in terms of our actual law and order. Now, I have colleagues in electoral studies who immediately jump to the conclusion that Australians are more authoritarian. What? You are Australian, and one of them's actually Irish. How can you say that? Have you met an Australian? Go outside the building, talk to them. Has anyone been watching that show, The Residents, on Netflix? They have this hilarious characterisation of Australians throughout. Even the Prime Minister and the Minister of Foreign Affairs is in it. And they just do what they want and just have fun. And the Americans keep commenting on it. And that's how when I go overseas, I find others find Australians more sort of fun-loving and a little bit more naughty. Does anyone think that's wrong? That that's not really what Australians are like? Australians are very hard-working. We're known to be very hard-working, but we're a little bit naughty. If the law's not a good reason or it's not going to hurt anyone to just infringe it a bit, they'll do it. And I thought, well, why are Australians so big on the law and order? And I think it's because most of us have signed the social contract. We have a closer relationship to our parliament than other people do because we don't have a Bill of Rights. We rely on Parliament to do what we ask. And when we have an election, nobody's going around saying that was, there's a few people on the margin saying that, but no one's saying that wasn't run properly or that wasn't the winner. All right, I didn't vote for them, but they won, and so they have standing, they have authority to make laws and to tell me what to do. And I think in Australia also, because everyone's voting, it's easier to revoke authority. So we don't feel so nervous about any law that's brought in because we know it's revocable. When government finds out we don't like something, they do something about it. They're quite responsive. Remember that time all the preferences went to these mad parties? And everyone really hated it. By the next election cycle, that rule had been changed. It didn't make much difference, but we were glad that they responded to something that was bugging everybody. I always think about how compliant Australians were during COVID lockdowns. Now, we had people in the streets complaining, that's true. But most of us were thinking, oh, come on, turn it up, go home. You're going to be spreading COVID. And remember that guy that was out buying barbecues, or that cab driver and that other Tasmanian guy that went rampant everywhere and spreading COVID? Everyone was just very mad at them. Nobody thought they were striking out for freedom. We were all like, get home and put a damn mask on. You're going to give us COVID. We went along with it. We went mad at those nurses that had a party. We were angry at Boris Johnson for having a party and flouting the laws. We just thought, you know, it's a real disease. We have more trust in science as well. I just think Australians might be a little bit more sensible. Well, I don't think that. I've actually got some evidence here for you in a minute, which also surprised me. What else might you get from high turnout, especially assured high turnout? Protection against democratic backsliding and democide. What is democide? Democide is when people kill their own democracy by legal means. What do you think which example do you think I'm thinking of? America. All right, and before that, in 1937? Hitler. People voted for that guy. And immediately he killed democracy. Now, he did it legally. So it also happens when autocrats start, that's been a voter, say an autocrat, secret autocrat was voted on a different platform, but they start doing autocratic stuff. If the public goes along with it, they're participating in democide as well, which again is happening in the US right now. So democracies the world over are currently in crisis, and democratic backsliding is when governments start becoming more autocratic and the public lets them. Australians tend to be like, what are you doing now? What do you think you're doing? Don't do that. Believe it or not, they are more attentive and governments are more scared of the Australian public. So here are some of the threats to democracy right now. Civic demobilisation, people not voting. Well, we've already got that sort of under control, but we've still got fights to fight. Political disinformation, believe me, compulsory voting is indirectly helping there, and I'll come to that in a minute. A rise in populist, anti-democratic and anti-liberal sentiment and extremism and polarisation. Compulsory voting most certainly helps there. Compulsory voting, sorry, compulsory voting. And political corruption and rising perceptions of political corruption are another source of democratic decline. Here are some studies on the effect of compulsory voting on polarisation and popularism. Polarisation and popularism scare the hell out of our intelligence services. It's taking up all their time now. So they would probably be, I'm guessing, happy about compulsory voting. Now here's Anthula Malkopoulou, who's a friend of mine and also a colleague. We became friends through having shared interests. She says that compulsory voting replaces the excessive mobilisation of discontented voters with a more universal mobilisation. So everyone's voting. You don't just have extremists at the margins. Compulsory voting addresses the problem of underrepresentation by offering a more pluralist type of representation than the populist one. In other words, one of the things driving the populism and the extremism is feeling unrepresented. But here, you can get some representation. And we also have a very nice voting system, a combination of PR and preferential voting that allows you to get some representation. And it also addresses the socio-economic inequalities that drive support for populism. One of the things that's happening there is that people feel left out. They're getting poorer and poorer and poorer. But because compulsory voting, due to the effects I've already explained, keeps the inequality at bay. We've got an inequality problem, but we're sort of holding it back. So overall, compulsory voting embodies inclusivist, pluralist and egalitarian values. Therefore, it addresses some of the grievances that drive the extremism and the polarisation. And there are a couple of other studies that made the same finding. Here's a study by Shane Singh, who really hates compulsory voting, but he had to admit it had this effect. It incentivises mainstream parties to move towards the centre of ideological space to appeal to all the more moderate voters that have been herded into voting in a compulsory system. So parties can't be too extreme, no one will vote for them in a compulsory system. And this study that just came out in the American Political Science Review, which is the best politics journal in the world, makes the same argument, but from the point of view of the voters. compulsory voting ensures that the apathetic and alienated don't give up on this system. Their kind of lack of extreme positions, almost their apathy, like, oh, I don't know, whatever, I don't really think about politics. But that apathy is actually a superpower that's enlisted to protect extremism. Now you might think, oh, do we really want these apathetic and people in the system that don't really care? Well, unfortunately right now we take what we can get, and I'm taking it. I think it's good. They're moderate, they don't think a lot about politics, but they're keeping things more stable and more moderate. Here's somebody that I'm always in a war with, Jason Brennan. We wrote this book together on compulsory voting. When I say together, he wrote his half and I wrote mine. And he says high turnout is bad. He says it actually pollutes the polls when all these poor people and uneducated people are voting. And he says compulsory voting is therefore harmful. He uses the term over-inclusiveness. You don't want these over-inclusive democracies. You get all this, voters you don't really want. Under voluntary voting, the median and typical voter is better informed, less biased, less bigoted than the median and typical non-voter. Can you imagine how hard this was for me to take as an Australian from someone who's American? No disrespect to Americans, but take it easy, man. He says compulsory voting makes the median voter and the typical voter more ignorant, misinformed, biased and bigoted. It's like a magic wand that makes the electorate dumber about politics. And he says because government gives people what they want, which it's supposed to do, and because they're dumber people wanting dumb stuff, governments do dumb things. So then I thought, oh, is that true? Are Australians or anyone in compulsory voting regimes dumber? And are our governments worse? I was thinking, I'm gonna prove you wrong, man. First of all, and then I found out these colleagues, these young women colleagues are all out there doing their doctoral theses on this topic. In some studies, it's said that the effect is neutral, but in these ones here, and the dominant ones, they're saying that compulsory voting citizens tend to be more attentive to the behaviour of their governments than citizens in voluntary regimes, and therefore more politically knowledgeable and sophisticated. So if you want to see any of these studies, and you're welcome to get a slide of the citation list at the end. Now, I think this probably helps to mitigate the effect of disinformation. First of all, Australians are more sophisticated, so they're all less likely to believe disinformation that's swimming around. Plus, we have public broadcasters that are trusted. We can always turn to them if something's not quite right. We can still get robust information. Second, 90% of Australians want truth in political advertising laws. They're not afraid of a law that stops a politician from lying. Most people in other settings will be scared. Where would that lead to? Thin edge of the wedge. Australians go, well, if I don't like it, I'll tell the government and it'll be revoked. So I would like to get that because I do not want to be lied to. So Australians are far more allergic to being lied to, and they don't think there's anything as alternative facts. Most of them don't believe in that. They think, they're facts and I'd just like to be getting those, thank you. And I find that very interesting about Australians, that they'd be that militant about it and that sure about it. Second, are governments really worse under high turnout? Well, we already suspect they're not. We already know they're more responsive and they're more representative. That's what they're supposed to be. But here's the thing that blew my mind. And this was a study that came out in 2009 by Sarah Birch, but nobody's contradicted this since then. Compulsory voting regimes have lower levels of political corruption. It's like, well, I'll take that, sweet. I hate corruption. I work for an anti-corruption watchdog. I hate corruption with all my heart. And if this is a sort of a silver bullet, and not 100% silver bullet, we still got corruption, but it really helps keep it at bay. Now, nobody actually knows why. And I would love to do some research on that if I ever get a spare second, but I would love to. But I have some theories as to why it's the case. First thing is that governments in compulsory voting regimes are more carefully monitored by their citizens because the citizens know they're going to be voting, so they're just keeping an ear out. They're watching. Who do I like? Who do I not like? I've gone right off you. I've noticed you've done this over and over again. They're more responsive to citizens' preferences. Now, what's that got to do with corruption? Compulsory voting governments, and high turnout governments too, are more likely to be serving the interests of the people. Now, corruption by definition means politicians are ruling in their own and their powerful pals than the people's interests. That's what corruption is. And when you look at Aristotle's original taxonomy, are the leaders ruling in their own interests or the interests of the people? When we know that government's more responsive, more representative to people, we already know that they're less corrupt. This in turn is going to enhance your levels of trust and legitimacy. A corrupt regime is not a legitimate regime. And finally, I think the other reason must be because there's less money washing around in election campaigns. Because, you know, if you notice some of the election campaigns in the voluntary systems, especially the American, all the hoopla and money and carry-on that's carried out just to get people to vote. Not even to get their vote, but to actually get them to turn up on polling day. This is already assured here. You don't need the same levels of money in the system. We've still got money problems that are being dealt with right now and can be dealt with in this setting. But there's just less need for huge amounts of money. In conclusion, here's my list of all the things I think you get for compulsory voting. And I'm not saying there are no downsides to compulsory voting. It is a form of coercion. But you get so much back. You get more and better information about citizen desires and preferences. You get better representativeness. Yes, I want that. You get more responsive government. I do want that. You get enhanced political equality. I love equality. Equality is good. Isn't that something we're supposed to get in a democracy? Now, there's some people that don't think equality is good and that some level of inequality is adaptive, and that's a particularly legitimate position, but you don't want a society with too much inequality. Those societies are unstable. The number one duty of the sovereign, the government, is to provide security and stability. So that helps you have that security and stability. You're going to minimise elite power. You're going to have a more alert electorate. We need that. We need citizens now to be conscripts in the fight against a democide. Others are letting their democracy just fall apart. We must fight because we can. We're one of the few places that's left that can do it. So we get this minimisation of elite power, you get a more alert electorate, you get democratic inclusiveness, which leads to mitigation of political polarisation, which is a threat to stability and security. You get lower levels of corruption, you get a sense of belonging and pro-sociality, higher levels of political satisfaction and trust, and therefore greater democratic legitimacy. And also, because of all this stuff, you're getting some protection from democratic decline and backsliding. It's not perfect. There's things we need to do, and I'll just conclude by telling you what I think we need to do. And these are things I'm working on right now. 1, retain and strengthen compulsory voting and our high standards of electoral management. We don't just get there because we've got a law saying it's compulsory. We get there because our elections are run so well. We have really, really good electoral management. That is actually the envy of the world over. And they try very, very hard. Sometimes they make mistakes, and I'm not very happy about it, and they shouldn't. But most of the time, they do a great job. And I work with these people. They are real, true believers, I promise you. Increased turnout among the young, that is a real fin in the water. We're in trouble if we can't get the young voting. Enhance inclusion among the unhoused, the prisoners, First Nations Australians and called citizens, because the more inclusive the society, the more stable it is, and the nicer it is. What's not wrong with having a nice, inclusive society? It has always been the secret of a stable, happy society. Enhance inclusion through reducing the growing informal vote rate. You don't have to worry about that. Just concentrate. Could you please concentrate when you vote? But I have to try and solve that. I don't know if I can, but I'm definitely going to try. I'm sure you all cast a formal vote, but even for a political scientist who works on informal voting, I have to concentrate so hard. It takes me half an hour to vote just to make sure I voted formally because our ballot's so complicated. And then 2 things outside the turnout box. Get ourselves some federal truth in political advertising laws to restore the declining levels of trust. They're easy to have. They just affect what politicians say and political actors say, not what everyone else in the political sphere says, just politicians and party officials. So it's quite easy to do. And here's one that I don't know if the young people will be happy with, but I want us to have compulsory civics education in schools. And I want it to be the law that you cannot get a SACE certificate or an HSC certificate unless you can prove you understand how our system works and unless you can prove you know how to cast a formal vote. Not that I think everyone should cast a formal vote, you shouldn't have to, but you actually know how to. And increasingly, Australian citizens don't know how to cast a formal vote. And I'll stop there and take questions. Sources there if anyone wants to see them.
Thank you, Lisa. So we'll now open it up to questions from the audience, but I'll begin with a pre-submitted question. So what does your research suggest about the role of social media or digital tools in influencing turnout?
I think the only effect it can really have is to depress turnout among the young and the gullible. There's a growing body of election conspiracies. You see what happens in America, right? And you think that can't happen here. We're having that happen here. And we're actually having, you have conspiracies like this. If you're not vaccinated, you can't vote. The Australian Electoral Commission has taken every Indigenous person off the roll. The Australian Electoral Commission uses pencils so they can rub them out and replace it with their own numbers. Some people believe that. That concerns me. I think it can depress turnout among the gullible and the young. I'm very worried about that. I would like to try and do something about the election conspiracism. There are some people now that are taking videos of election workers, following home in their car and encouraging people to attack them. Yep. And I never thought, here in Australia, but it's happening. When the Electoral Commissioner asked Twitter, was X, or maybe it was Twitter then, to take down some of the notices, it took down some. It wouldn't take down one that was threatening violence against Australian election workers. So that's a big thing in America. 25% of election workers in America have resigned for fear of violence and actual violence. And these discourses through social media are just imported here. It's very easy because of the internet and because of social media just to bring this kind of disinformation into our sphere. And so I would dearly love to try and work on that, and I am working on that right now, trying to think of a way to deal with it. But that's the main way I think it can affect turnout. Making people think it's a waste of time.
Great, thank you, Lisa. And was there any questions from the audience?
The argument against compulsory civics was always led by the Liberal Party, arguing you can't do it because the teachers are all left-wing. At the time, I was a member of the Young Liberal movement and could not believe this attitude. I'm no longer a Liberal, I may add. But having said that, do you think this problem is still there, that the Liberal Party will still continue to oppose compulsory civics because they believe it will be biased because the teachers are all overwhelmingly left-wing?
I think the best solution to that is to have a national curriculum that's approved by everyone, written by, I've offered to do it for free in my spare time. And I would go into schools and teach if I needed to. So you just have a curriculum that's objectively agreed to be kind of neutral, and you can overcome that problem. You wouldn't leave it up to teachers to necessarily, hopefully, editorialise too much, but of course everyone does editorialise. But if you had a curriculum and that you had to prove you could pass the test in that curriculum, I think we can overcome that problem, yeah.
Yep, just a question up the front here.
Thank you. Do you think there is any appetite in Australia to make local government election voting compulsory? And do you think that if it were, then that perhaps the level of corruption in local government would actually be reduced? And do you see corruption in local government as potentially being a current problem for Australia?
I think we all know, we look at an ugly building and we think, what the hell, how'd that get built? Or we see something strange happening, all right? Corruption is everywhere. But newsflash, and not everyone knows this, and I wasn't aware of the extent to which, most states now have moved over to a compulsory system. I think WA and South Australia are the last ones left, for local elections. And I've been asked all along what I think of that. And I don't think Australians have necessarily a big appetite for it because, I think it's a good thing. I think you're exactly right. It will help reduce corruption for sure. But one of the problems is, there's two problems. There's a thing called voter fatigue. Like the Swiss, they have thousands of elections, they vote on everything, and they only get 39% turnout. They vote a lot, but not all the time. Not everyone turns up. They get tired of voting, so you can't make people vote too much. The second thing is all elections have information costs. And the information cost is the cost of getting informed so you can make an informed vote. And most people want to make an informed vote. But it's really hard in local elections because we're used to having a heuristic, a shortcut, which is a party affiliation that helps us know, oh, is this the Labor? Is this the Green person? When they say they're independent, what does that mean? Is this a corrupt one or a not corrupt one? I don't know. It's too hard to find all that information out, isn't it? So that's the other problem. Unless right now in local elections, more independents run, or more people now there's a rule in a lot of these settings that you have to declare if you're affiliated to a party, which some people don't like, but I actually think that's a good thing, so you can see. So look, I think you're absolutely spot on. It would probably reduce corruption. They probably should be compulsory, but they're not compulsory here, but there's a debate on right now in South Australia about that, whether we should do that. Thank you. Good question.
I think we have time for about one more question. Just.
I think we'll take a couple because I went over time, so I don't mind staying back if others don't mind staying back.
Okay. So maybe just a question down the back.
Hi, Lisa. Thanks. That was an excellent talk. I did just have a quick question.
Who's talking? Can you wave your hand? Oh, there. Okay, thanks.
Now and then we get, and more often these days, we get people discussing perhaps lowering the voter age. So
Yeah.
people are looking for 17, 16-year-olds to vote, whether it's compulsory or voluntary, looking at that. Do you think that would have an effect on, in the same way high voter turnout, compulsory voter turnout does in strengthening democracy? Do you think that would also have a positive effect to strengthening democracy, or do you think there's other issues there?
Thank you, that's a great question. I do think it would. I've been advocating it. I'm uneasy about it, but we know that voting's a habit, and because young people in Australia don't stay in the habit, we know that if young people start at 16 and 17 while they're still at home, they keep the habit. So it would be a good start. We could have voting in schools. We could have we could have mobile polls there. We could have voting on a school day. That way we're getting their turnout. But there are downsides to it, but I actually think we really need to work hard now to get young voters in the system. So I think that's where we need to go. When I look at all the studies, and I did, on voting capacity, I was thinking, look, I want my son when he was 16 to vote, as if. And but then I looked at all the studies, and a 12-year-old can vote as congruently as an older person. A congruent vote is when you vote according to your own preferences. Now, a lot of people don't know how to vote congruently. We saw that in America. People voted for Trump thinking he was going to like them and look after them. More women voted for him than for Kamala. More Hispanics. More African American women voted for Trump. He doesn't even like them. He's mean to them, but they thought he would be nice to them. Now, they've done experiments in Belgium and in other places where they've lowered the voting age. The young people did better. For Scottish independence, they were more knowledgeable, more engaged, more willing to turn out. They can cast a vote that's congruent with their expressed preferences. This is because, I was thinking, how can this be? Voting is like a test. They're just as good on things to do with cold cognition, which is like a test when you're calm. But when hot cognition's engaged, when you're with your friends, you're in a car, you've all had a few to drink, and you think, let's drive off a cliff. And they'll go, yeah, what a good idea. Not that they'd do that, but they're more likely to do it when they're a bit drunk or when they're surrounded by their friends or when they're in a social situation. But when they're in a test-like situation, which in Australia, voting really is like a test, and I admit they're very complicated ballots, they can vote just as well. And I really think young people are in so much trouble if they don't start defending themselves from what is happening to them. They're getting poorer and poorer and poorer. Their lives are more precarious. They're less likely to be able to have good super, permanent jobs, houses, and they need to get busy. So I'd be prepared to have all the young people in the world not like me, for advocating lowering the vote to 16 and 17? Sorry, that was a long answer. But it's a complicated question, isn't it? Because we're all sitting here thinking, oh, I don't know about that. I think it would work.
Thank you, Lisa. We'll finish question time now, but if you're happy to maybe stay back and answer a couple of questions from the audience.
Yeah, sure. If anyone
afterwards.
wants to come up and ask me a question, feel free. And
Yep. So thank you very much for tonight, Professor Lisa Hill, and thank you to our audience for viewing and asking insightful questions and comments. So be sure to sign up to our mailing list to receive the latest information about Research Tuesdays, and have a good night.
thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming, everyone.